You're 24 years old, and you can find a signal in weather that would ground a carrier pigeon. That's not a compliment they give you directly. It's just the reason you're assigned to the Itasca and not somewhere quieter, running routine traffic between shore stations where the frequencies are clean and the operators mostly wait. The Itasca is a Coast Guard cutter positioned in the Central Pacific in July of 1937, and your job is to maintain radio contact with a Lockheed Electra being flown by a woman attempting to circumnavigate the world at the equator. And the job sounds straightforward until you're actually inside it, and then it's something else entirely. You're not the navigator. You're not the captain. You're not the person whose name goes into the newspapers when something goes right. You're the operator, the mechanism, the man in the radio room with the headset on and the log open and the pencil moving at the speed of whatever comes through. You've been doing this for 3 years. You type fast and you listen faster and you don't add things and you don't subtract things and you keep the log the way the log is supposed to be kept. That rule held until the morning of July 2nd. The thing about hearing a voice clearly is that eventually you hear something in it you weren't supposed to hear. And then the voice is gone, and what you heard is the only thing left, and someone is asking you to write down a different version of what you know. The radio room on the Itasca was small in the way that everything on a cutter was small. Functional compression, every surface earning its square footage. Two receiver units, one transmitter, a frequency panel, the log desk bolted to the starboard bulkhead with a gooseneck lamp that rattled when the hull moved through chop. You'd personalize none of it. You were trained not to. The operator doesn't decorate. The operator maintains the equipment and the record and the neutrality between them. The log was a standard Navy issue bound ledger. Each entry, time in Greenwich mean, frequency, call sign, signal strength on a 5-point scale, transmission content verbatim, operator's initials, the entries accumulated at whatever rate the traffic demanded. On quiet nights, the pages barely moved. On operational nights, they filled fast, in your handwriting, in pencil, the marks of a man trying to keep up with what the frequency was delivering. You'd established rules for the work before you had language for them. They came from the training and from the 3 years of practice, and from a specific lesson a senior operator named Kowalski had given you on your second week aboard a different vessel when you'd paraphrased a transmission instead of logging it verbatim, and he'd made you copy the handbook section on log integrity by hand twice before your next shift. Rule 1. The log is not your interpretation of the transmission. The log is the transmission. Word for word, signal strength accurate, time stamped to the minute. You are not in the log. The log is just the log. Rule 2. You stay on frequency. When you're assigned a watch, you're on it. Not mostly on it. Not on it when the traffic is interesting. The frequency that seems quiet is the frequency that produces the transmission you missed if you leave. Rule 3. Signal strength is an observation, not an opinion. You mark what the equipment tells you. You don't adjust it to match what you think it should be. Rule 4. The log goes up the chain. Once a watch ends, it's not yours. It moves to the officer of the watch, then to the record. Then, wherever the record goes, you're a relay. You transmit and receive and document, and then the document leaves your hands, and you start the next page. Rule 4 was the one that stopped being true on the morning of July 2nd, 1937, at 8:43 Greenwich Mean Time, when a voice came through your headset from somewhere to the southeast and you wrote down everything it said, and then, 6 hours later, you wrote it down again with different numbers. The Earhart operation had been running for days before the critical window. You'd established contact protocols with the Electra in the approach phase. She was flying east toward Howland Island, a dot of coral and guano in the Central Pacific that was functionally invisible from altitude without precise navigation. The Itasca was her radio beacon, her homing signal. If she could find you, she could find the island. If she couldn't find you, the math of fuel against distance became a different kind of calculation. You'd been logging her transmissions since the La departure. The early ones were clean, strong signal, good timing, the voice of a woman who had done this enough that the procedural language came without apparent effort. Her call sign, her position estimates, her fuel state, her requests for bearing assistance. You'd log them all. Signal strength between 2 and 4 consistently. The kind of contact that means the equipment is working and the operator on both ends knows what they're doing. Then the signal started degrading. You'd seen this before. Pacific operations, long overwater legs, atmospheric interference building through a flight's duration, frequency drift as equipment warmed and the air changed, the signal drops, the transmission becomes intermittent, the operator on the receiving end leans closer to the equipment as though proximity helps, which it doesn't, but the body does it anyway because the body is less rational than the training when something important is coming through badly. At 7:42, you logged a transmission that was partly unreadable. Signal strength 2, voice breaking, position estimate unclear. The content you logged was accurate to what you could hear, with a bracketed notation where the signal dropped out completely. At 8:43, she came through clean. That's the transmission, the one you think about in both versions, the one that exists in the log you filed and the log you kept and the space between them, which is the space where you have lived, in the part of yourself you don't show anyone, for the rest of your life. Signal strength 4, maybe pushing 5. You note this before anything else because it surprises you. The preceding transmissions had been degrading, and this one came in like she'd moved closer rather than farther, which made no positional sense but made complete acoustic sense, the way signals sometimes resolve unexpectedly in the Pacific when the atmospheric layer shifts and suddenly the frequency opens. You lean into the headset and you hold your breath the way you've trained yourself not to hold your breath because breathing affects your ability to parse the audio, and you start writing. She gives her position estimate first, specific, more specific than the previous transmissions, then fuel state, then a frequency request. She wants a bearing, a directional signal she can follow in. Her voice is calm, not forced calm, not the control of someone managing fear. Actually calm in the way that very good operators are calm, where the emotion and the task have separated and the task is running on its own. That's what you hear that you weren't supposed to hear. Not the words, the tone underneath them. A woman working a problem, running the math, adjusting the variables, the professionalism of someone who has been in difficult situations before and knows the protocol and is executing it with the focus of someone who isn't done yet. She isn't panicking. That's the thing. That's what you carry. You finish logging the transmission. You send a bearing signal in response. You send it again. You log the send times and the frequencies. You maintain the watch. You wait for the next transmission. It doesn't come. You stay on frequency for 4 more hours. You log everything. The silences, the atmospheric noise, 2 unrelated commercial transmissions you rule out immediately. A Coast Guard relay from the mainland that has nothing to do with the operation. You stay exactly where Kowalski's Rule 2 told you to stay, and the frequency delivers nothing further, and at some point, the watch changes and what was a search becomes something else, and the log moves up the chain, and that's how Rule 4 is supposed to work. At 14:17, you're called into the communications officer's cabin. He has your log on the desk in front of him. He wasn't a bad man. You've spent time on that question and come back to the same place. He was a man in a chain of command that had already received guidance from above about how the morning's events were to be documented, and he was sitting across a desk from a 24-year-old operator and explaining that the position estimate in the OH843 entry needed to be reconciled with the official search grid, and that the signal strength notation was inconsistent with the equipment readings logged at the station receiving position, and that the transmission time would be adjusted to reflect a different point in the flight's trajectory. He said all of this in the language of administrative correction, reconciliation, consistency, the words of a man describing paperwork rather than the words of a man asking you to write false numbers in a legal maritime record. You listened. You kept your face still. You asked 2 questions and received 2 answers that were not answers to the questions you'd asked, which is its own kind of information. Then, he slid a fresh log page across the desk with the adjusted parameters already penciled in at the margins, and he said that your cooperation with the official documentation process was a matter of operational protocol, and that you understood operational protocol, and he said the last part without quite making it a question. You took the page, you went back to the radio room, you sat at the log desk for a long time. The gooseneck lamp rattled with the hull movement. The frequency was quiet. Outside, through the porthole, the Pacific was doing what the Pacific does. Enormous, indifferent, maintaining its own record of the morning in a language that doesn't use pencils. You picked up the pencil at some point after midnight. The fan in the overhead was rotating slowly. The ship was quiet in the specific way ships are quiet when the work of a day has concluded and what's left is maintenance and watch and the hum of the engine below everything else. Nobody was standing over you. Nobody was watching you through the porthole. Nobody had threatened you with anything that could be named in a sentence. You wrote different coordinates, different time, different signal strength. You initialed it the way you initialed every entry. Your standard mark, unchanged, the same initials that appeared on 3 years of accurate logs before this one. That's the whole moment. A fan, wrong numbers, a quiet room. The anticlimax is the point. You've come to understand that. The biggest decisions of your life don't announce themselves. They arrive in ordinary rooms at ordinary hours, and they're over before you've fully understood you were inside them. You folded the original log page twice. You slid it inside the back cover of a navigation manual on your personal shelf. Pacific Frequencies, 1934 edition. You'd been meaning to replace it with the current edition for 6 months. You didn't examine why you kept it. The examination would come later, in installments, over years. What you understood in the moment was only that you couldn't put it in the burn barrel. That was as far as the reasoning went. The navigation manual went on the shelf and you went back to the watch and the frequency delivered nothing further that night and you didn't sleep until the third morning after. The search lasted 17 days officially. You ran radio watches through all of it, logging every frequency sweep, every transmission from the search aircraft, every silence that stretched across the log page in your initialed handwriting. The handwriting was the same as it had always been. The entries were accurate to what you heard. The original page stayed in the navigation manual. The manual stayed on the shelf. When the Itasca returned to port, you packed your personal gear and the manual went into a duffel with your extra socks and your civilian clothes and a photograph of your mother, and you carried it off the ship with the same physical weight it had always had, which was almost nothing. That's not what it weighed. You were stationed in San Francisco for 14 months after. Then, Pearl Harbor reorganized everything and you were somewhere else and then somewhere else after that. And the war made the Pacific enormous in a different way than it had been in July of 1937. And you ran radio operations through 4 years of it and logged millions of words and maintained the rules you'd been trained with and broke only the one you'd already broken, which had already been broken and couldn't be unbroken regardless of what you did in any subsequent watch. The navigation manual went with you. 3 postings, 2 vessels, a shore assignment in Guam. It sat on whatever shelf was available at whatever billet you occupied and accumulated the dust of 3 different climates, and you never opened it, and you didn't need to open it because the entry was in your handwriting in pencil, and you had read it once before folding it, which was enough. The details don't leave the person who recorded them. That's the thing about being the operator. The log is external. The record in your head is not. After the war, you were assigned to a training position in San Diego, and you met a woman named Helen at a dinner organized by a colleague whose wife knew her family. Helen was from Sacramento and had worked in a naval administrative office during the war and understood the particular quality of silences that servicemen brought home with them without needing to have it explained. She didn't ask you to explain yours. You married her in 1948, and the navigation manual went into a box in the garage behind whatever accumulated there over the years. Baseball equipment eventually, when your son got old enough, and holiday decorations, and a set of tools you used occasionally and then less often as the years moved. Helen introduced you at dinner parties as the man who was the last to hear Amelia Earhart. She was proud of this. She said it with the warmth of someone who understood she was offering people something genuinely interesting, a piece of proximity to history that the man next to her carried without drama or elaboration. You smiled every time. The smile was real in some directions. You were glad she was proud of you. You loved her. In the way that 14 years of a life shared becomes its own irreducible thing. What she was proud of was accurate in the way that the amended log was accurate. You were the last operator to hear Earhart. The log said 843. The signal strength was what the log said it was. The position estimate was what the adjusted entry recorded. These things were true in the version that existed. You never told her about the navigation manual, not because you didn't trust her, because telling her would mean showing her who you were in a quiet room at midnight with a fan overhead and a pencil in your hand. And you'd spent enough years with that image of yourself that you didn't want to make it visible to someone who loved you. The armor of her pride was something you wore without deciding to. It fit. It cost something to wear it, but it fit. The call came on a Tuesday morning in 1951. You were in your office at the training facility, reviewing the watch rotation for the following week. The phone rang. A voice introduced itself by a title attached to a federal agency and said it was following up on records related to the 1937 Earhart search operation, specifically communications logs from the Itasca. The voice was polite, institutional, the kind of professional warmth that has been practiced until it sounds natural. It asked if you still had any personal records from the operation. Notes, personal logs, any materials not submitted through official channels. You said no. You were telling the truth. You had no personal logs, no notes. What you had was a page of your own handwriting folded twice inside a navigation manual in a box in your garage, and that page was the official log, the original of it, the one that had been replaced by the amended version submitted through official channels. Whether that qualified as a personal record not submitted through official channels was a definitional question you processed in approximately 3 seconds while the voice on the phone waited. You said no. The voice thanked you. It said it would be in touch if further questions arose. It didn't call back. You sat in your office with the afternoon light coming through the window and a half-reviewed watch rotation schedule on the desk in front of you, and the phone, back in its cradle. You thought about the specific way Goering's interpreter, you'd read about the Nuremberg proceedings, you'd read about the booth, thought about the way a person who carries two versions of a thing lives with both of them simultaneously. You understood that better than the articles explained it. You drove home. Helen was in the kitchen. Your son was in the yard. The garage was the garage. You didn't go out there. You had dinner and helped with homework and sat in the living room with the radio on and didn't think about 8:43 until Helen had gone to bed and the house was quiet, and then you thought about it the way you always thought about it, which was briefly and completely, and then you put it back where it lived and went to bed. The navigation manual is still in the box. The box is in a storage unit now. You moved twice after the San Diego house. The garage didn't come with you, but the box did because you packed it yourself and you knew which box it was and you made sure it was in the unit and not in the items donated or discarded during either move. Helen thought it was old technical manuals you kept for professional reasons. She wasn't wrong about the manual. She was missing the interior of it. She died in 1979. 3 months after the funeral, you drove to the storage unit and stood in front of the box for a long time. You didn't open it. You couldn't tell you what you would have done with the page if you had. The question felt like the same question it had always been, just with more weight on it now that the person whose pride you'd been maintaining wasn't available to be protected. You closed the storage unit and drove home and made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table in the quiet that Helen's absence had made permanent and specific. There are people who spend years trying to reconstruct the last transmission, the coordinates, the heading, the fuel state, the specific words. They build models and run analyses and produce conclusions that conflict with each other and get revised when the next analysis arrives. You've read some of this material. The signal strength matters to them. The time matters. The position estimate matters enormously. You have a page with a different position estimate in a box, in a storage unit, in pencil, in your handwriting, initialed the way you initialed everything. You know what it says. You know what it means for the models and the analyses and the conflicting conclusions. You've never contacted any of them. This is the part you've thought about for 40 years and still don't have language for that satisfies you. It's not indifference. You know what the page contains and you understand its relevance. It's not fear. Whatever was going to happen to you for what you did in 1937 didn't happen, and enough time has passed that the institutional mechanism for making it happen has probably dissolved. It's something else, something about the specific weight of a thing held so long that releasing it would require explaining why it was held, and the explanation would require standing in a quiet room at midnight with a fan overhead and accounting for the person who picked up a pencil and wrote wrong numbers without anyone making him. You're not sure that person is someone you can make legible to people who weren't in the room. The original log entry says 8:43, signal strength 4, voice calm. Position estimate coordinates that place the Electra in a different position than the amended version records. The voice working a problem, the professionalism of someone who isn't done. She wasn't panicking. That's what you carry, not the coordinates, not the signal strength, not the specific words, the tone underneath the words. The calm, the evidence of a mind still solving, still adjusting, still running the calculation between where she was and where she needed to be. You heard that. You logged it accurately in pencil on a page that no one has seen since July 2nd, 1937. You've been the only person who knows the sound of her voice in that transmission and what the calm in it contained. That's not a legacy. It doesn't have a name. It's just what you're holding in the storage unit and in the part of your memory that runs the watch that never goes off rotation, in the frequency that's been open for 40 years, waiting for a transmission that isn't coming. Helen introduced you as the last man to hear her. She was right. You were the last. What you heard and what the record says you heard are two different transmissions in the same moment. You've been the booth between them for a very long time. Some frequencies stay open long after the transmission ends. This story is fiction, but the mechanism is real.